Alright, so in this section we're quickly going to go over the matte shadow catcher. Now as you can see in my scene, I have a ground plane and a dome light, which I've set up with a background image or a backplate. So I have my actual HDRI linked up here, and then down below under backplate I have an image that is just always facing the camera, and that's what we're actually seeing in the background there. You can see if I turn it off, we get just our HDRI. Now the purpose of the matte shadow catcher is to essentially shine through to the camera our background, but still cast shadows and reflections and receive lighting from our scene. So effectively we want to use this anytime we want to take an image that we already have set up, ideally with an HDRI dome light, and add a 3D object into a scene. A very common case for this is automotive rendering. So to do this, all we do is go and let's create our redshift material. And we're going to go ahead and dive in. And you can see I've got my standard redshift material node by default in there. So I'm going to go ahead and drop my shader onto the ground. And you'll see, we get what we would expect. So next I'm just going to type in matte in the search bar, and let's just go ahead and directly pipe out the matte shadow catcher to the surface. I can go ahead and get rid of my old material. And you'll see now that our shader is entirely black. That's because we haven't told our shadow catcher what image it needs to display. And you can do this one of two ways. One, you can pipe in a camera map image where you project the image along the plane. And to see how to do that, go ahead and check out the camera map section. But in our case, since we already have a backplate image or an HDRI image, we can actually go ahead and tick the first option, which is background is environment. So now as you can see, our background image is coming through our shader, and we're getting this nice shadow cast from our dome light. And as you can see, if I tick shadows off, we no longer are going to have any influence from our shader. So let's go ahead and tick catch shadows back on. So let's go ahead and talk about catch diffuse. So if I go ahead and tick this on, you're going to see that now my ground plane also looks like it's picking up bounce lighting from our object in the scene. If I go ahead and give this a 100% color, you'll see we really are catching this effect now. Another way to make this very apparent would be to add a illuminated material. So let's go ahead and flip on a sphere for a moment, and we'll just go ahead and increase its emission color. Now you'll see that we're picking up our diffuse lighting from the sphere in our matte shadow catcher. And if I tick catch diffuse off, we'll see that lighting goes away, and we're only receiving our shadows because we still have catch shadows enabled. So I'm going to go ahead and leave catch diffuse on at a 50% gray, and we'll turn our sphere back off. And so we can also alter the color of our shadows. You can see our shadow color here. We have the option to set as something else. For example, if we wanted to make it green, or perhaps just slightly lift our shadow color. We can do that. But really, if we want to add a lift to our shadow, we want to dial in this ambient color, which is going to, if I overcrank it, it's going to simulate the look of a GI, more or less, influence. So if we really wanted to add a little bit of lift, I would start with ambient color first. In this particular case, I do not want to do that. Alright, let's quickly talk about saturation. You'll see I've added a light into the scene, and now we're getting some red in our shadows. If I go ahead and pull saturation down, you'll see that we no longer get that color influence in our shadows, so that can be useful. As well, transparency. As we drag transparency up, you'll see that our shadows become more and more transparent, or more or less disappear. Alright, so moving on to reflections, let's go ahead and tick on cast reflections, or catch reflections rather. And this is just going to give us a glossy appearance to our shadow catcher. You can see we have a weight as well. We have a glossiness amount, and as we drag this down, we're going to get blurrier and blurrier. Color does exactly as we'd expect. It's just colors, the color of our specular that we're seeing on our matte shadow catcher. Flip that guy back to white. Attenuation is a pretty neat one. When I flip it on, the distance is set to 0, so it's not enabled. But if I flip it up to 1, you'll see that we're pretty much seeing nothing here. But if I set it up a bit higher to something similar to a distance in my scene scale, like maybe 100, you'll see we start bringing in our reflections a bit. I'm going to go ahead and dial this up to 500. And the higher we crank our attenuation, the more apparent our our reflections are going to be. It almost makes it look kind of a bit fogged, but I find that it helps. For example, if we give a rather blurry reflection and dial our distance down a bit, it can help kind of give you almost like an IOR or a fogging type effect for the reflections. Kind of a before and after there. And by fogging, I guess I mean that it seems like the farther, if our ground plane was 0 and above our ground plane was in a positive direction, so like +1, and our downward direction is a -1, the farther we go in the negative direction, the more our reflections fall off. And this distance, is a number that directly correlates to that fall off. All right, let's flip that off. Lastly, we have ambient occlusion. So I've gone ahead and turned off all of my other options, and we'll just look at ambient occlusion. That's going to give us exactly as we would expect, which is just the ambient occlusion on our ground plane or matte shadow catcher object. Max distance works in a similar way to the attenuation. 0 disables max distance, but if we enter a number in, like 50 for example, you can see our radius for our ambient occlusion is quite low. As I crank this up to 100, 200, you'll see that our radius begins to increase. Set that back down to 0. And of course, our shadow color for the ambient occlusion is again exactly as we expect. If we flip this to a green, you'll see that our ambient occlusion is now green. Alright, well, thanks for checking out the matte shadow section. We'll see you in the next one.